in our look at the developments for African Americans during this period, we got to start with the Jim Crow era. The Jim Crow era begins when Reconstruction ends in 1876 with the election of Rutherford B. Hayes. Now, you'll remember that the the deal was that when there was a tie in the Electoral College, in the House of Representatives, they some there was a special committee that decided the election, and in that committee, they agreed that the Republican Hayes could become the president if the federal troops were removed from the South. And so that's what happened. When the federal troops were removed, that meant that basically the federal government was going to look the other way as the South did whatever it wanted to the African American population. And that's where we get the Jim Crow laws, separate but equal. Although, as we'll see, that term doesn't actually come into play until the 1890s. The Jim Crow era was kind of signified by a not just social segregation of African Americans, but economic segregation as well. African Americans were only allowed to have the lowest paying jobs. They were only allowed to live in the worst neighborhoods. This was in the South. Remember that in the North, even though segregation was what's called de facto segregation, that means it's just a fact. It's not by law. The only legal segregation you find is in the South. There were some areas that were like border areas. Indiana is a prime example where you did have African Americans moving up into that state throughout this period. Illinois would be another one. And Indiana did actually have Jim Crow laws, although they removed them in the 1920s or 30s. I can't remember which one. So during this time, African Americans were not just taking things lying down. While in the South, education was denied African Americans on a systematic basis. And so part of that meant that they did not have the resources to mount legal challenges. In the North, however, they did. And so the first major legal challenge is not the first, but it gets to the Supreme Court. I guess you could almost call it the last legal challenge of the period, is the Plessy versus Ferguson case. And so Plessy versus Ferguson, you had a man named Homer Plessy who volunteered to be a test case. This was in Louisiana. Louisiana passed a segregation law that segregated the trains. So this is a newspaper account illustration from the period. You'll notice here that Mr. Plessy is very obviously African American. That was not the case. Plessy was 1/8 African of African descent, which meant that his great grandmother was black, and everybody else in his family was mixed. And so what that meant for his skin tone and his features is he passed for a white person. That's how he was able to get on the train in the first place. And once he got there, he had to tell them that he was an African American, at which point the case came in. And so it goes all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court decided that as long as there are separate accommodations, then it does not violate the 14th Amendment. And so we have the car for white folks, the car for black folks, the Jim Crow car. This cartoon was from 1904, just after the case was settled. And it shows the obvious disparity. I know it's just a little drawing there, a little cartoony drawing, but it shows the idea. The black train car was basically a cow car with a 2x4 nailed on the side for your whole butt doesn't even fit on the seat, whereas the white car was very comfortable and spacious. Just like any Supreme Court case, it should be noted that one justice, Justice Harlan, dissented and said that the entire case was a farce because it was based on the idea that African Americans were socially, genetically different than white people, and he did not believe that to be the case. So just like any Supreme Court case, this is going to set precedents. It's going to be followed, and it's going to justify segregation, not just for African Americans, but also Asian Americans in California. The case Lum versus Rice was a was another major case. This was in the 1920s, I believe, where you had Chinese segregation, or I'm sorry, Asian American segregation, and it justified it based on arguments in Plessy versus Ferguson. Of course, it's not until Brown versus Board in the 1950s that this is going to be overturned finally. Now, the group that Ferguson was a part of, that Plessy was a part of, was not the only one mounting legal challenges. The Niagara Movement was another movement of African American intellectuals who try to fight segregation through journalism and through legal challenges. And we'll talk about them more in a little while. But it should be pointed out that the only way that this can occur is if you do have wealthy African Americans, which you do. You have them in the North, and you actually have a small group of what would be called the Black middle class in the South. These people are people who benefited from the Reconstruction period in a way that they benefited monetarily. They got an income. These people that were elected to various political offices, and that couldn't be taken away from them. And because they had access to money, they did have those resources. And this is why this is going to be the beginning of the development of Black education systems throughout the South, what's going to be known today as the historic Black colleges and universities. And so we'll get into them in just a minute. This would be the Niagara Movement here. Their dress kind of betrays the fact that they're wealthy. The ladies wearing white with the white hats. This was a very common garb at the time for people who were active in the political movements. Women who were active in political movements. So this would be mixed in with the suffragette movement that was also going on at the time. Leadership in the Black community. You had a couple survivors from the pre-Civil War days, most notably Frederick Douglass, who he's going to be the American minister to Haiti. I mean, he's going to be an ambassador. He holds multiple political positions, as does some of his children. He's going to stand up for Black rights, for civil rights, against Jim Crow, and he's going to do that until he dies in the later part of the century. The other major figure that we want to focus on for this early period is Booker T. Washington, and that's him there in the middle. Here he's standing with, this is William Howard Taft, who would be president after Roosevelt. Here's Andrew Carnegie, and another guy whose name escapes me. And so he was probably the leader of the African American rights movement in the late 19th century. Booker T. Washington was a man who was born a slave, and I believe we discussed him in class, where he started Tuskegee University, where his vision was that as this industrial revolution is happening, he wants to put African Americans as skilled workers. So he's going to create skilled workers to give them economic power. He believed that if African Americans could prove themselves to white America through hard work, through gaining, basically making themselves irreplaceable in society, then they would get rights. And so you see down here, this would be a publicity photo here for Tuskegee University, where you see people working in chemistry. But this isn't a university. It's an industrial school where they're learning mechanics. Here there are, new techniques in building houses. These young men are working in what I believe is a carpentry shop. They also learned the newest farming techniques. What we have to remember, and what the criticisms of Washington was from the Black elite, was that basically he was training African Americans to do the jobs that African Americans already did. And so the argument was that they're not going to gain anything by keeping doing things at the bottom of the ladder. But as you see, white people really liked Washington. He's the first African American man invited as a guest to the White House for dinner by Theodore Roosevelt, who pretty much lost the support of the South for doing that. Here, obviously here he is with Taft and Carnegie. So they're throwing money at him for this school, and that's how he was able to educate thousands of African Americans both men and women, and gave them kind of that step up. Um, Obviously, we can look and say, did it work? Well, no, it didn't. I mean, it created a little bit larger of a black middle class, and it's really going to be building that foundation for the groups that are going to fight in the civil rights era. Also, during this time, we have the Niagara movement morphs into a group called the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and that happens actually right after a very large race riot in Springfield, Illinois. And basically, they decide the leadership of the Black community decides that they need to step it up. They need to work harder. And the NAACP, part of that movement is going to be led by this man on the left here, W.E.B. Du Bois. It's also going to be led by a woman named Ida B. Wells, who I don't have a picture of. And she is going to lead the anti-lynching campaign, trying to get a federal anti-lynching law passed. And she started that in the late 1890s. Did not get passed until last year, 2019. W.E.B. Du Bois's philosophy was, and he was very critical of Booker T. Washington. In fact, they had a very, very vocal public feud about it. Basically, he said that what we should be doing, what the African American community should be doing, is investing in what he called the talented 10th, the best 10%, and training them to become lawyers, doctors, to basically train them to become an elite so that they can fight for the rights of African Americans. He was a big proponent of Howard University, one of the historic Black colleges, and Du Bois himself was the first African American who graduated from Harvard. He was a historian and a philosopher. He also believed in a movement that we're going to talk about in the next unit called Pan-Africanism, where he's going to be actually trying to elevate the rights of people of African descent globally. However, he was kind of on the fringe prior to 1920. Most African Americans followed Washington's philosophy. If we're going to be accepted, we have to prove ourselves to white society. And the best way to prove that you are American is to fight a war. We saw this with the Germans during World War I. They proved their loyalty by signing up. We'll see it again when we talk about Japanese Americans during World War II. That prove your loyalty by basically dying for your country. And so one of the first big opportunities in the military for African Americans was a group that were called the Buffalo Soldiers. Buffalo Soldiers were African American military officials that were sent west to fight Indians. They got the name Buffalo Soldiers from Indians during the Indian War because they said that they had skin the color of a buffalo skin, and their hair was like buffalo hide. And so what you have here is, and there were critics of this, that Black elite criticized this. Basically, why should Black people go fight other minorities? All of this kind of philosophy really comes to a head in the Spanish-American War. Now, I have a picture here from the Spanish-American War and of soldiers. This is Teddy Roosevelt in the middle. These are the Rough Riders. You'll notice that there are 0 Black people in the picture. And that's kind of common. Not kind of, it is. I mean, that was the name of the game back then, was basically in Roosevelt's famous fight at the San Juan Hill in Cuba. Very publicized. Roosevelt leads the charge of his own personal military up San Juan Hill and secures it for the people of Cuba, liberates it. But what the stories and newspapers and the photographs all leave out is that before San Juan Hill could be taken, Kettle Hill, which was right next to it, much larger, much more heavily defended, had to be taken first. And that's what the African-American brigades were sent to do. And so the only reason Roosevelt could make his charge up San Juan Hill is because African-American soldiers had cleared the way. Of course, they get no credit for this, and they're kind of pushed to the back. And there were a number of Black newspapers at the time that argued both sides. African Americans should join the war. They should view Filipinos as their enemy. Whereas others said, basically on the lines that, Muhammad Ali's famous quote, that no Vietnamese person ever called him an N-word. There were people arguing the same way about the Filipinos during the Spanish-American War. The last war of the period, of course, is World War I, where you have a number of African-American units. This one is the most famous. They're called the Harlem Hellfighters. Basically their story, it's a great story. You should look into it. The French were losing, of course, very early in World War I, and they were begging the Americans for aid, but America refused to join the war until we were properly trained, which, as you may remember, took about 9 months from the point of the declaration of war against Germany in 1917 until American troops en masse actually entered combat in 1918. And so what the American government did was basically, because of its low view of African American soldiers, we agreed to let this battalion, General Pershing, allowed the Harlem Hellfighters to go over and fight for the French army. And in doing this, they won multiple awards. They were huge heroes in France. Several of them won what's called the Cross de Guerre, which is the highest military medal that someone can earn in the French military. They also saw time. They were sent over to try to stop the Russian Civil War as well. And all this time, they are being treated. They're being paraded throughout Europe as heroes. And then imagine after the war, they come home. They come back to their homes in the South, and it's back to Jim Crow. In fact, several of the Harlem Hellfighters ended up with criminal charges because having a taste of freedom, knowing that outside this kind of closed off area of the American South, people don't treat African Americans, people of African descent, that badly. There wasn't segregation in France. There wasn't any rules against hanging out with white people, going out with white girls. And then they come back home, and it's a completely different story. And it did not end well for these gentlemen. Last thing we got to talk about for African Americans this period is opportunities. The war era provides opportunities not just in the military, but in other senses as well. African Americans were drafted at a much smaller rate than white people during World War I. And so those jobs became open, and African Americans in the South that had been stuck in sharecropping and very low income agricultural jobs, along with the pressures of the Jim Crow system, they start moving up north during the war to occupy these factory jobs for newly opened factories, and then also filling the positions that white factory workers left as they left for the war. And so here you have what's called the Great Migration. It's the dotted lines. This is a later migration. And so it's a large-scale movement from the South up to northern cities. And of course, it's not just, leave Alabama, go to Detroit. You have a large number of people that are stopping at major cities in the South and on the border as they go up. And so places like St. Louis, Missouri, Louisville, Kentucky, Cincinnati, places in northern Virginia are going to, the Black populations are going to rise. And as they do, there's going to be conflict. And we're going to talk about that conflict more in the next video. But one of the results of this is the development of large African-American ethnic enclaves within these major cities, Harlem being the largest and most well-known one. Here we've got some pictures of families moving north with everything they have, piled all in the car. Obviously, the people who are doing this movement are people who are not the lowest classes, right? Because you got to have money to move, to relocate. And so the South is actually going to lose that Black middle class during this time. And as they lose that, any kind of like chance of education, and therefore what we call social mobility, ability to move up the scale, is going to leave the South and it's going to move up to the North. Good for Northerners, bad for Black Southerners. But we see the percentage. Please do not hear me that that all the black people moved to the north. That is not what happened. What you have here, look at 1890, 90% of African Americans are living in the American South. By the time we hit 1930, it's down to 79%. That's a lot of people, but it's not a huge percent. It's not really until 1970, you see, that this movement starts. But that Great Migration, it represents that dip right there. Things have been the same since the founding of the country, and then all of a sudden, we get that dip. All right, that's the end of the video. Tune in next time for the second part.